Hi everybody. This class we're going to be discussing free will and two competing theories, hard determinism and libertarian free will. Now, free will is a very tricky subject and there are many implications that go along with it. And we'll get into those a little bit afterwards once we've described really the two main competing theories with free will. And the first is going to be hard determinism. Determinism is that scientific explanation of free will that suggests that any event that is chosen by a person is chosen for specific reasons. Think back to the principle of sufficient reason that we discussed earlier in this class. This applies to hard determinism. Essentially, what we're saying with determinism is that there are antecedent causes for every action. So when I decide to do something, it's for a set of reasons. Understanding those reasons come from prior reasons and prior reasons and prior reasons. And so in this chain of events that occurs, hard determinism would suggest that I am determined to make my choice based on a prior choice that was made in the past. And because everything has this prior reason, this cause, everything seems to be grounded in something else. And so our will is not free in this instance. We would understand hard determinism to mean that there is no such thing as free will. Remember back to when we talked about the principle of sufficient reason, when we discussed René Descartes and rationalism. The same thing applies for free will, in that there are reasons that are sufficient for causes in the future. These reasons themselves have their own set of reasons, and those reasons have their own set of reasons. So every event that takes place is caused by a prior event. This is why we have no free will, because there's no way in which we can actually make a choice at any given time. Our ability to choose is combated by the fact that what we choose is determined by previous choices that we make. Everything is grounded in something else. The problem we see with things like the principle of sufficient reason, and we've spoken about this earlier in the class, is whether or not it's in fact true that everything has a sufficient reason behind it. Perhaps there are instances or actions that we see that have no antecedent cause. Think about the Higgs boson particle. When discovering the Higgs boson particle, we seem to believe that this is the smallest piece of matter that exists. We refer to it often as the God particle. And this particular piece of matter is suggested to not have a cause associated with it. So if the Higgs boson is itself its own cause, then it will not have an antecedent cause that creates it. This would throw a wrench into a deterministic position with regard to free will. If the principle of sufficient reason is false, and not everything has an antecedent cause, then it would seem as though determinism would be false. The problem, however, is that it seems as though when it comes to scientific discovery and innovation, that there is always a prior cause. And if we don't know what that prior cause is, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, only that we haven't understood or discovered what that cause is. So perhaps in the future, we may discover what makes a Higgs boson particle. And then in the future, we might discover what makes that piece of matter, and so on and so forth. This, of course, creates much implication in terms of where and when matter and time begin, as discussed earlier in this class. When we're thinking of determinism, however, and I'm going to interchange determinism with hard determinism. For the purposes of this class, they'll be the same. The argument for determinism goes as follows. The past controls the present and future. You can't control the past. Also, you can't control the past. You can't control the way the past controls the present and the future. Therefore, you can't control the present and the future. It would seem as though this is the most scientific and physical account of free will. We are focusing our attention on physics and the workings of cause and effect, and suggesting that because past events cause future events, and because we can't control past events, we can't also then control future events. We are essentially slaves to actions that have been done in the past, and therefore are guided by those actions throughout time. Now, there are many implications to this understanding of free will when we speak of determinism. The first is that if my actions are not free, and my actions are only controlled by antecedent events that have happened in the past, then it would seem as though I do not have control over my actions or the future, because the past is already the past. It would then seem as though my responsibility for the actions that I'm doing are not in my control, and therefore I am not responsible for them. If I have no free will, how can I be held accountable for the actions that I'm doing or will do in the future? Take, for instance, a criminal who has committed robbery. Now, that criminal only commits robbery and is not free to do so because they are forced to commit robbery because of some antecedent event in their life. And that antecedent event in their life is caused by another antecedent event in their life, and so on and so forth until their very birth. So from the time of birth until death, all of our actions are forced based on events that are happening from the beginning and even before then. Now, intuitively, we would think that anyone who's forced into doing an action would not be to blame. But maybe that may not be the case. During this week's lecture, I want you to continually think about what moral responsibility's role is in society, and whether or not our freedom to act bears on our moral responsibility. Another implication to hard determinism is that society looks a lot like programmed robots. When we think about the existence of a robot and it being programmed to act, we would most likely be inclined to suggest that those robots don't have free will and cannot act for themselves. But how exactly is a human any different than a robot. If hard determinism is true, it would seem as though that our actions being controlled by antecedent events looks a lot like programming that forces us to act in a certain way in a given time. And so what you see in society is essentially programmed individuals doing the thing that they were programmed to do and having no choice but to do the act that they were programmed to do. This position is a popular position with physics and scientists, or physicists and scientists, and seems to be a very close-knit philosophy to that of materialism. If all there is material things, and material things work off of cause and effect events, then it would seem as though if humans are no more or less physical than anything else in the world, that our actions are cause and effect in that same way. If, however, we suggest that no, we are free to make decisions, a person must explain where this freedom comes from. What is it that makes us free, and how do we make a choice between behaviors and decisions that provides some semblance of moral responsibility? It cannot be the case that we accept a thesis that there is no such thing as moral responsibility. If there is no moral responsibility, then society would result in chaos and anarchy. Instead, we need to accept the idea that people can be blamed for their actions. Similarly, a person should not be to blame, however, for the death of a drowning person if he or she could not have saved him or her. So take, for instance, a car that careens off of a road into a lake. If you're unable to swim and therefore cannot rescue the people in the car, we wouldn't suggest that you are to blame for their death. If, however, you were a Navy SEAL or an Olympic swimmer, and there would be no harm to come from you by trying to save a person in a car that went into a lake, in that instance, we might say that you are to blame if you could have done something but have chosen not to. And this is where moral responsibility becomes a big problem. If you're forced into a situation, there will be no moral responsibility. But when you can choose to do one thing over another, and your options are plentiful, then we would suggest that praise and blame then comes into play. We live in a society that deals with moral responsibility, praise and blame, guilt and innocence. And so it's important to understand what it is that we have the ability to do, and to determine whether or not this sense of free will is an illusion or something that we should take seriously. The competing theory with hard determinism is that of libertarian free will. And libertarian free will suggests that a person is able to freely make a choice based on having a set of possible alternatives. In the case of libertarian free will, my choice to do something is not necessitated by antecedent causes. So when I wake up in the morning, I have the choice to get up and go to work or to call in sick and sleep in. According to hard determinism, I would not be free to make that choice, and that my choice would have been made for me by prior choices or desires that work is so important that it can't be missed. So I'm forced to get up and go to work because I desire to get my paycheck, which is caused by my want for paying rent, which is caused by my desire to live in a house. You can see with hard determinism that there's always these antecedent causes. With libertarian free will, however, my actions are chosen purely on the basis of my desire in that place of time. So if I wanted to go out and eat all of the candy and soda that I wanted to, I could do that because I wanted to do that, not because of some antecedent event that has caused me to do that in my history. So while hard determinism suggests that there is no free will, libertarian free will is going to suggest that we do in fact have free will and we are able to choose our path. Once again, however, it's important to note that with libertarian free will, it'll be important moving forward to really understand where this freedom comes from and how it comes about without antecedent causes. So what is it that really makes us free to make these decisions? How is it that I can simply choose between two options? And what does it mean for me to be free enough to choose? Have desires? Can it be the awareness of my consequences that allow me to be free in making my decisions? What is it about us that's free that doesn't succumb to this principle of sufficient reason? Am I always bound to antecedent causes, or am I ever free from any burden of choosing one position or the other and can therefore freely pick between multiple options? Is it the case simply for libertarian free will that I just have alternative options so that if I could go in different directions, that itself is what makes my choices free? Let's talk about the principle of alternate possibilities for a minute. With the principle of alternate possibilities, it's the case that an agent has free will and can be morally responsible for an action if the agent can have done otherwise, meaning that there are multiple options in play, and when I do one action, I could have done another. If there are these multiple possibilities and I could have alternate possibilities for my future, then my choosing one or the other gives me that free will. So in the next election, I'm free to vote because there are multiple parties that I could vote for. If there was only one party and I had to vote for that party, we would be inclined, I think, to suggest that you weren't free to make your decision who to vote for, given the fact that you had to vote. Now, even if there's only one representative that you can vote for, you still have the option not to vote, which provides alternate possibilities. I can vote Republican, or I can choose not to vote at all. But if I'm forced into an action and can only ever do one thing, we wouldn't necessarily think of that in terms of freedom. Now, this being the case, there are certain instances that Harry Frankfurt devised that argue against this principle of alternate possibilities. For information on this Frankfurt case, or Frankfurt cases, please see the video assigned for this week's material. Now, I'll spell out the video in summary. And essentially, when it comes to alternate possibilities, Harry Frankfurt devised this thought experiment where a person is tasked to go vote, and they can either vote for a Democrat or a Republican. Now, the individual is typically supportive of Democratic policy. But the Democrats in this scenario get worried that the voter may switch over to the Republican side. So they implant a device into the individual's head in case he or she is going to vote Republican. The device will only be activated if the voter goes to vote Republican, in which case the device will be activated and the voter will be forced to go vote Democratic. If the voter votes Democrat, the device implanted in his or her head will not activate, and they will just be allowed to vote Democratic. Now, say the voter enters the voting booth, and because the voter is typically a Democrat, they vote Democrat down the ticket. Harry Frankfurt would suggest that in this case, even though there are no alternate possibilities and the voter would have to vote Democrat, we could say that that voter acted according to free will, even though there were no alternate possibilities. According to Frankfurt, there must be something more than just alternate possibilities that gives a person free will. And so there are many questions that need to be answered when we're speaking of free will. And the first one is going to really address the next lecture. In that, is there any way to accept the physical reality of determinism while still suggesting that humans are free to make choices? Is there any way, therefore, to bridge the gap between determinism and libertarian free will? Next lecture will be just that. It will be a discussion on a middle ground theory referred to as compatibilism, namely the compatibilism between determinism and free will. But even with compatibilism, we'll still see that there are problematic aspects of really understanding where our freedom comes from. If I'm free to make choices, what makes me free? Because as we've seen earlier in this class, my actions are typically influenced by antecedent causes in the past. So I desire something because something else has happened. And I desire that thing because something else has happened. So I think the scientist in us would suggest that determinism seems to be the default position in understanding how the material world works. But therein lies a problem, in that, is there just the material world? This takes us back to Descartes and our understanding of what exists, and whether or not we do have some ability that's not grounded in physics that allows us to be free to make decisions. And if we are able to be free, what is that freedom? Is it simply the ability to choose between two alternate possibilities? Is it the ability not to be burdened by antecedent causes when making decisions? And really understanding the implications that our understanding of free will suggests. Things like whether or not we can place blame or praise on an individual. If I'm not responsible, if I can't have chosen to do something, why should I be blamed for doing it? In this instance, it would seem as though the hard determinist would have to suggest that, well, no, you shouldn't be blamed for things you will have to do. But this, of course, is problematic as well, because a society wouldn't be able to exist without praise or blame. Another question that free will raises is that of minded creatures and rights. If I create a robot that seems to act like a human, should that robot be given the same rights as any other person? They act the same. They're determined by antecedent causes. While a robot may be designed and programmed to do a certain thing, it would seem as though humans are no different. A human is born with certain DNA and certain features of the body that allow it to do certain things and not other things. And from there, we learn through our society what's right or what's wrong, how to act according to the law, and so forth. But all of this stuff is based on the fact that there are prior events that teach us how to exist in the world. No different than what I can imagine a robot doing, even though a robot begins to be programmed to do a certain thing. Just like I can reprogram a robot, I could also reprogram an individual by using hypnosis or advertisements, by socially indoctrinating an individual in some way, shape, or form, is to get them to believe certain things that I want them to believe. In these cases, we really need to ask whether or not humans themselves have free will, and what would come of a society if we determine that either there is no free will, or free will is something that we can grant to not only humans, but things like robots and all other animals.